exporting. And let's see, is it going to crash? No, it's not crashing so far. Okay. Hopefully this will last through this demo. Okay. So what we're talking about today is exporting files. So let's close this second. And I'm going to open a text document. So exporting files. So we're going to talk about file size, file types, and the main ones we're going to look at are JPEG and PNG. And that's honestly pretty much it. We'll talk a little bit about what's called compression and lossless versus lossy compression. So those are a few different terms that we'll want to keep in mind. And that's pretty much it. That's what we're going to be talking about. Yeah, we'll take a look first at how to export a file, and then we'll talk a little bit about these other considerations. So I'm going to go back to my Photoshop intro folder in my MMP 100 folder that's on my desktop and open up intro.psd. And here we have our image. I'm just going to go with this. I'm not going to make any changes. I'm just going to start working on exporting. And so our file right now is a PSD file. That's why it has like the little Photoshop icon when we look at it on our computer. Oh, another thing real quick. You guys, if you're on a Windows, if you're on a Mac, you should see how it's kind of small, but see how my Photoshop file says intro.psd and like my images say .jpeg at the end. Those are file extensions, which helps the computer understand what type of file it is. But on a Windows, the default actually is that it doesn't show those. So you may not see those if you're on a Windows computer. But you can make it show up if you go to the View section in the Finder, in the File Explorer, and click on File Name Extension. So yours might look like this, where your Photoshop just says Intro, your Notes just says Notes, your image just has the name of the image. But we really want to know, especially for this particular lesson, but we do in general want to know what type of file these are. And so if you're on Mac, it should show by default. If you're on Windows, you may need to go to View and just go to File Name Extension. And that will show you what type of file. Okay, so notice the images, they have like a little image preview because they only have image data in them. Our Photoshop file is different. It has a lot more data. It has all these layers. It has all this stuff that helps us continue to edit things. Once we export the file, we sort of like commit to this version of the image. And so we can't go back and later update that unless we have the original PSD. So the PSD file is kind of like our editing file. It's sort of like if you were making a film, you would have like a lot of film that you were gonna, you have your original film with like lots and lots of footage, and then you cut the film together, and then you publish, an edited version of the film that has the right sequencing and the right dialogue and things like that. And once you have that, you need to make it, you make a copy, and that's what you send to the movie theater or whatever to show the film. So our PSD file is kind of like our original footage, which we can still make edits to. But what we want, notice one thing, if I click on the PSD, it shows me down here, this is 23 or almost 24 megabytes, which is a pretty large file. If I click on this image, it's only 153 kilobytes. So a megabyte is 1,000,000 bytes, and a kilobyte is 1,000 bytes. So a kilobyte is much smaller than a megabyte. And so 153 megabytes, kilobytes, even though it's a larger number, it's smaller than 1 megabyte. 1 megabyte is equivalent of 1,000 kilobytes. Let's write that down. Most of the files that we're going to see are either in megabytes or they're in kilobytes. And 1 megabyte equals 1,000 kilobytes. Okay, so an image that's 153 kilobytes is much, much smaller than an image that's even 1 megabyte, whereas our Photoshop file is 24 megabytes. So it's very large. So, it's all a little bit relative because the amount of data that we can fit on our devices is always getting bigger. But we know that Wally is already having issues with storage on his computer. And I'm sure most of you guys have had at some point in your life, you've probably gotten a message from your iPhone or your computer that says you're running out of storage. Everybody's gotten that at some point. And so that's basically what we're talking about. Files take up space, and even though we have a lot more space than we used to, we still have a limited amount of space on our computers. And so if we want to have a lot of files, we need to be careful about how big they are. Another concern is like streaming and the internet. If I want to send somebody an image, if it's 24 megabytes, it may take them a while to download the image. It's going to take up a lot of it's not very good. If we can convey the same information in a much smaller file size, that's much better. It'll go faster for the user, and it'll take up less of their data plan. It'll take up less of the information that's traveling. So, especially when we're making websites or things for social media, we want to make files as small as possible while still conveying the same information. So the information is the pixels in the file. Okay, so let's go to Photoshop again. So if we want to export this image, we just go to File, and there's a menu for export, and there's a bunch of different options here. Quick export for PNG. This will just make an image really quickly, but it's not going to make it particularly small or optimized. So if you're in a rush or you don't really care, that's a good option. Export as has a few more options. And then Save for Web is the old version of this that shows you a lot more options. If you're curious to learn about more stuff, I would take a look at that. But we're going to go with Export As, which is look at that. Okay, so when you bring up Export As, it's going to show you what the image is going to look like. I'm kind of running out of. Not really, but I'm just going to deal with it. Okay, so it shows me what the image will look like. I can zoom in on this and get a preview of how the image will look once it's exported. Okay, so it looks pretty good. So this is the PNG. That's kind of the default image type for the internet, or one of them. And it also shows me how big the image will be. So it's 1.5 megabytes, which is much smaller than the Photoshop file, but it's still a lot bigger than our JPEGs that we originally downloaded. So I can turn off transparency. That'll save me a little bit of space, but not too much. But I can also say smaller file. This is going to change the number of colors in the file, but it also makes this file much smaller. And since I'm not using transparency, I can save a lot of room. And this is under a megabyte, which is good. It's not perfect, but it's still pretty good. And that's about as good as I can do with a PNG. And the reason for that is because PNGs are lossless. Okay, so a PNG equals lossless. And that means none of the color data from my original image is disappearing in order to get the files. And we'll look at what that means in just a second. So when I'm done with this, I can click Save down here. It's hard to see, but I'm going to save this. I'm going to make sure to put it, so it's in my Photoshop intro, and it's just intro.png. I'm going to click Save. And now when I go back to the File Explorer, here's my intro.png. And this is just a regular image. Like, I can throw this onto the Discord channel really easily. It's not going to complain at all. Put that on here, and I can hit enter. And there it is. You guys can download that image, and there you go. You can't edit that image, right? So if I click on this image and go to open with, choose another app. We're going to Photoshop for this. So if I open this in Photoshop, there's no layers anymore. So what we did when we exported the image is we squished everything together into one layer. And so that's why it doesn't take up as much space on the computer. But now I don't have the layers that I used to have to edit over. I just have the image data and that's it. And it's literally just the colors. So if we zoom in, all it is just what are these colors, and that's all the image is going to tell. So that's my PNG, and we can see it's 726 kilobytes. So, it's a lot smaller than the Photoshop file. It's like, less than 1/25th of the size. But it's not as small as it could be, right? Like I have these images over here that are JPEGs that are much, much smaller. And if I open these up, they look pretty much the same, right? Like, can I tell the difference between that and that? Not really. They look pretty much the same to me. And in fact, the image that I'm looking at here that I photoshopped actually uses the data from these two images. So it seems strange that there's more information here, but that's because it's a PNG and it's lossless. So now we're going to look at how to get the file size a little better. Let's go back to Photoshop. One easy thing I can do is I can make the image smaller. So if I go back to export and go to export as, I can actually change the image size here. So let's scale it down. Let's say it's 50% as long. Now it's not quite half the size, but it's 400 kilobytes. It's much closer to what I want for a based image. I really don't want anything over like 200, 300 kilobytes, but oh no, I don't want to replace this. Let's call this intro 50 for 50%. Save that. Okay, so now I have two versions of this image. Okay, so now I have two versions of this image. This one is 700 kilobytes, and this one is 400 kilobytes, but this one is half as large. So if I increase the size of this one is much smaller. Okay, so if I'm only going to use this image for like a phone or a small device, that's not a big deal. I don't really care that it's much smaller. But if I'm going to use it for, full screen on a computer, I need that extra data. So I need the full size. So making the image smaller is not always an option. That brings us to compression. So what compression does, and I'm going to just use the text pad. Okay, so let's talk about compression. Compression is basically a way of saving information, but making it as small as possible. So all of these files are really just like a list of numbers because the computer really only stands. And so let's actually like do some compression. I'm going to make a new image file, and I'm going to make it. Let's make it 16 pixels by 1 pixel. I wonder if Photoshop will even. Okay, so this tiny, tiny little line. Zoom way in on this. Okay, so here's my line. And I'm just going to draw, I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to turn the hardness all the way up. And I'm going to turn the size down to like, and I'm just going to make 2 little drawings. Okay, I actually have some gray pixels in here. Not quite what I was. Let's erase. Oh no, it's too hard to. Okay, I'll just erase both of those. That's fine. Here. Okay, so let's say this is our image. This is a really small image, but just for the sake of this exercise, let's say this is our image. And what we want to do is we want to save this image so that it can be recreated as little data as possible. So we take up as little space as possible. Okay, so I'm actually going to make a new text file. And I'm going to increase the size here. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to say this is my image. Okay, so we have two colors and we have one line. So we only have one line of data. So we're just going to write all the pixels in a row. And we have two colors. So one color we have is white. And we can represent white. The easiest way to represent white is with a hex value. And I'll show you what that looks like. We go to color.adobe.com. Actually, let's just use a color picker. Okay, so this is Google's color picker. I'm just going to drag this up to white, and there's a hex value. That's probably the smallest way we can represent white. It's just 6 Fs. So we have our first pixel is FFF, FFF. Okay, so that's our first pixel. Okay, we're off to a pretty good start. Now we need to draw the second pixel. So we're actually kind of like ignoring a lot of other stuff about how this image is created, but just talking about the pixel. So just starting with very small amount of. So the next pixel is the same thing, right? So I could just put a comma here to say go to the next pixel. And I could do this again, FFF, FFF. Okay, now we have 5 black pixels. Okay, so for black, the easiest way to represent black is just 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay, so let's do that. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, comma, and now I need to do this 5 more times. Okay, so I'm just going to copy and paste. Copy 1. Okay, let's wrap. Okay, I'm just going to put them on a different. Ignore the line breaks. They're going to add our file size, but that's okay. Okay, so now we have 5 black. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 white pixels. So we're going to take these Fs. 1, 2, 3, 6. And then we have 3 blacks. So I'm just going to take these pixels again and draw 3 more blacks. Okay, so let's say this is our image data. And let's just assume that our image program knows that there's only one line of pixels, so we don't need to tell it how many lines there are. And we just have, we're just going to add the color to each pixel after the color. So how much data is that? Where did I save this? File as. Oh, I put it in the wrong. Go back to the desktop. MP100, Photoshop intro, image.txt. Okay, so this is 142 bytes. It's very, very, very small. So that's good. But what if we wanted to go even smaller? Because keep in mind, we're only recording 2 colors and we're only recording 1 line. So in a normal image, there's a potentially million different colors in this. There's at least, we know actually how many lines there are because we can go to the canvas size and we can see there's 1,213 lines and there's 1,920 pixels per line. So that's a lot more than what we have here. So if we were going to try to make this smaller, one easy way that I could do this, and one of the ways that compression works, is instead of saying F and then repeating the entire color here, if I want 2 whites, what if I just said F times 2? Okay, and then I can get rid of this line. And now I have zeros. I can say 0 times 5. Okay, so then I can get rid of this line. Okay, so do you see how much simpler this is making our program? So then I have F times 6. Okay, so now we get rid of this line. And finally, we have 0 times. Okay, so now my file is 42 bytes. I got rid of over half of the data in that file just by doing a different method of telling it where to put the pixel. The one problem here is this only works if my program knows how to read this. So that's why we have these different file formats, because different file formats have different programs that say this is how to put together these pixels. Okay, so let's go back to our file format. So PNG is lossless. That means that none of the colors are deleted ever. So that's good for image fidelity. But in an image like this, there are lots and lots of colors, which is why our file size for our PNG is quite big. It's 720 kilobytes. So a JPEG uses compression. And what it does is it looks at the colors that are next to each other and it says, you know what, if these two colors are basically exactly the same, we're just going to call them the same color. So let's look at this image. Let's zoom in really, really close. And I'm going to go over to my color and I'm going to use the color picker. And so this color is this value, red 108, green 133, blue 192. And this color right next to it, it's almost exactly the same. So will I really be able to tell the difference in this image if these two colors, if I just use one color for that color? It kind of depends, right? It depends on if there's, how many different colors there are, if there's a big contrast, lots of different factors. But we can kind of do this compromise where we take out some colors to get a smaller file. So let's go back to export as. And instead of PNG, I'm going to use JPEG. And JPEG has this quality filter. So if I turn the quality up high, the image is quite big. It's 686 kilobytes. So it's almost as big as a PNG. If I turn the quality down low, it's very small. It's 42 kilobytes. And you probably didn't even notice the image change. Maybe if you have really good color detection in your eyes, noticed. But if not, you probably can't tell the difference. Let's zoom in and see if you can tell the difference. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in into this lizard where there's a lot of color detail. And so here's high quality, 7, and here's low quality. Okay, so now you can probably see the difference, right? Where there used to be lots of little colors, here, there's boxes. We see these artifacts. These are called artifacts of compression, where we can see where the algorithm to do the compression is getting rid of certain colors to make things simpler. If I zoom way out, it looks basically the same, right? You can't really tell. But when I zoom way in, then we start to see. But if we turn the quality up to like 5, okay, that looks pretty good. That's only 185. So maybe that's good enough. Again, it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on, what the ultimate goal for this project is, whether you're printing it really big on a piece of paper that's going to go in an art gallery, then we want to use lossless compression and make it look as beautiful as possible. If we're putting it as, a thumbnail on a website that you click on to go to an article that nobody's ever really going to look at, then we might not worry so much about the quality. So I actually think, let's see what 6 gives us. 6 is 318. That goes over my arbitrary 300 threshold. So let's do quality is 5, 185 kilobytes. I'm going to click save. And now we have a JPEG. And I can put this in the Discord. And tell me if you guys can tell the difference. Okay, so those are the two images. One on the top is a PNG with all of the original color data. The one below is a JPEG that is less than half of the size, like a third of the size of the top image. So if you guys can tell the difference, you have pretty good color vision. Color difference, that's probably okay. So I think that's about it. We talked about file types. Okay, let's say JPEG equals lossy. It takes data out. Cancel. That's pretty much everything we need to cover. So there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to the history of compression, and we'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about audio in our next section. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. There's like an interesting political history around things like MPs and different image types. And there's interesting kind of like argument types of compression and things like that. It is pretty nerdy, so not everybody is going to care that much. But it's important to understand at least the basics so that when we create an image, you're not sending, if you send your friend an image, on their phone, and suddenly their phone is out of storage. That's going to be kind of annoying. And also sometimes, I'm sure this has happened to you guys where you try to post an image on Instagram or Twitter and it says like this is too big or this isn't the right type of file. If we understand how these files work, we'll have a much easier time navigating the media world, especially now that so much stuff is online. Online places a lot more limits on things because we're transferring internet and there's, it takes time and there's other, that's why we try to keep our files. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording and we'll start some workshop time.